Some of my critics, when I showed up to the University of Pittsburgh, tried to blow me up, which I find very impolite. I think that was very wrong of them to do. A couple of Antifa operatives showed up to this appearance I had at Pitt, and they burned me in effigy, and they set the street on fire, and then they threw an explosive at the venue when I started to walk on stage, which was not a very warm welcome. In fact, it was a very warm welcome. It was a burning hot welcome, but it was not very nice. So when I received this invitation to Cornell, I feared I might face a similar scene. Cornell, after all, is one of the early hubs of leftist violence on campus. The takeover of Willard Straight Hall in 1969 is probably the most infamous such incident in American history. I'm sure that everybody in this room knows about the takeover. For those of you at home who are not familiar with it, on April 19, 1969, rifle-wielding black student radicals stormed and occupied the Willard Straight Hall at this very university, evicting parents who had been visiting their children for the weekend and inflicting maximum reputational damage on Cornell. Why did the students take over the hall? According to the armed occupiers, the takeover was a response to reports of a burning cross at the Wary Student Center the night before. White supremacists threatened black students, and so the black students threatened back. But it turns out that the whole thing was fake news. It was Jussie Smollett, the prequel. It was all just a big hoax. Ithaca police never managed to track down those elusive cross burners, and they suspected that the Afro-American Society members themselves set the blaze in order to justify further protests. This thesis was not just the result of knee-jerk prejudice. One member of the Afro-American Society later seemed to confirm it. Stephen Goodwin, a Cornell student who was the treasurer of the Afro-American Society, called the cross-burning, quote, a setup. The society had contrived the hoax, according to Goodwin, quote, to bring more media and more attention to the whole thing. Now such hoaxes have become commonplace. What did the radicals want? The chief demand was the creation of an Africana Studies department. Africana Studies, like virtually all of the studies departments, is a pseudo-academic discipline that replaces liberal education aimed at discovering truth and disciplining the will and intellect with training in political activism that undermines a student's education by encouraging a radical skepticism that denies the very possibility of discerning truth, thereby degrading politics from a rational endeavor into a battle of irrational will. Before the student paper calls me racist, I'm sure that the pens are already aflutter with that accusation. Please rest assured that I feel the same way about all of the critical studies departments, whether we're talking about queer studies or women's studies or even American studies. The only difference between American studies and all of the other critical studies departments is that American studies is the only studies that hates its own subject. So queer studies loves queers. Women's studies loves women, at least as long as they're feminist. Black studies loves black people. Only American studies hates its subject, which is America. But I digress. I could go on about that all day long. The great economist and social writer Thomas Sowell, who is 93 years young and still sharp as a tack, Thomas Sowell, one of the great living American intellects, he took an even tougher view of the motives for the takeover. Thomas Sowell, who had joined the Cornell faculty 4 years prior, right before the Willard Straight Hall takeover, he observed that the white president of Cornell had, quote, sought to increase minority student enrollment and to do so by admitting students who would not meet the existing academic standards at Cornell, which meant that, in Sowell's words, quote, the emphasis was on getting militant ghetto kids, some of whom turned out to be hoodlums who terrorized other black students in addition to provoking a racial backlash among whites. This is, of course, exactly what happened. Had Cornell hired faculty and accepted students without lowering standards, had the newly recruited black population of Cornell been made up entirely of Thomas Sowells, there never would have been a Willard Straight Hall takeover, and there never would have been a creation of this pseudo-academic department, and the students would have been required, as they previously had been, to get an education if they wanted to graduate. The black activism was the most visible, but the same pattern applied to all of the other supposedly aggrieved groups that demanded special treatment, thereby lowering the standards for everyone and producing now multiple generations of highly credentialed, extraordinarily ignorant radicals. Today, sadly, but not surprisingly, some of the Cornell administration seems to look back on the school's greatest shame with indifference at best, and more often with pride. The official Cornell website reads, quote, "Within Cornell, the takeover has come to be seen as an event that gave birth to enormous social, governance, and ideological change." It's a very diplomatic way of putting it. A headline linked on the website reads, quote, "A campus takeover that symbolized an era of change," with AK-47s evicting parents from their rooms. Yes, the change of the American university, not just Cornell, not just the Ivy League, virtually all of them, from institutions of higher learning for producing educated citizens into radical indoctrination factories for producing ignorant activists. The new perspective is no coincidence. The radicals won the campus fights of the 1960s, and they now run those universities as tenured radicals, to borrow a phrase from Roger Kimball. Today, according to a number of surveys, some 24% of college professors in the social sciences call themselves radical. 21% call themselves activists. 18% call themselves Marxists. The ratio of liberal to conservative professors, according to another survey, is 8-to-1 in poli-sci. That's pretty bad. It's 17-to-1 in history departments. It's 44-to-1 in sociology. It's 48-to-1 in English. And it's 108-to-0 in race and gender studies. I don't really know how that one works. I was not a math major, but I suppose I would even think it might be higher. As my friend Chris Rufo pointed out in his excellent new book, America's Cultural Revolution, the most prominent leaders of the radical student movements of the 1960s, I'm thinking of Bill Ayers, the leader of the Weather Underground, which was a terror group for those of you too young to remember, Angela Davis, a communist terrorist who plotted an attack, a kidnapping that left 4 people dead, including a judge. Those people and many others ended up with cushy university sinecures. Meanwhile, the radicalism spreads. Yet again, on Cornell's campus, which just last week saw the arrest of a student who was threatening to kill all the Jews. Just my luck. I survive Antifa at the University of Pittsburgh, and I end up at Cornell with Hamas. What are the odds? All the way up in Ithaca. I didn't think they could get this far up. The student behind these threats, Patrick Dye is a little on the nose if you ask me, apparently posted notes to an online discussion site threatening to, quote, shoot up 104 West, which seems to be the kosher dining hall, as well as to stab and slit the throat of any Jewish men he found on campus, and to do all sorts of terrible things to Jewish women that he found on campus, and to behead Jewish babies before finally threatening to, quote, bring an assault rifle to campus and shoot all you pig Jews. This is not good. The liberal media did not quite know how to react to the threats because the threats did not fit the pre-written narrative. If a student threatens Jews on campus, that student is supposed to be a skinhead neo-Nazi. He's ideally going to be one who voted for Donald Trump. Best of all, he would be one who listens to a lot of conservative media, all of whom can then be vilified after the incident. Short of that, the student should at least be Arab. Arabs were considered white, according to official government documents, for a lot of American history. So in that way, the media could twist it into the guy being like sort of white, kind of like George Zimmerman after the killing of Trayvon Martin. George Zimmerman was reported. The guy is as Hispanic as they come. They said he's a white Hispanic. You know, he leans white anyway. He identifies as white. He's transracial, I don't know. Then the liberal media could at least blame white people for perpetuating the Islamophobia that drove this hypothetically Muslim student to threaten to kill all the Jews. All that would have worked fine for the narrative. But when the threats come from a random Asian guy, the liberal elite has no idea what to do. Even conservatives might be a little confused over how to react. After all, conservatives have spent the past 7 or 8 years at least describing ourselves as the defenders of free speech. Free speech absolutists, some have called themselves. Not me, but some of them have done that. But of course, threats have never been protected speech in this country, or in any sensible country for that matter. Neither has libel, neither has obscenity. For much of American history, we had laws against blasphemy in many parts of this country. No one ever considered that to be some grave violation of the First Amendment. The principles of free speech. Even John Locke, who is one of the most articulate defenders of free speech ever, he's the father of liberalism, even Locke argued in the letter concerning toleration that atheists should not be afforded free speech or really any rights at all. All societies have a right to standards. And in any case, all societies have standards and enforce standards, whether they recognize some right to them or not. I've mentioned this fact once or twice, that the real debate here is not between free speech and censorship, but between competing sets of standards grounded in competing conceptions of the good, the true, and the beautiful. I will not belabor the point. If you'd like to hear more about it, you can always get it in my book, Speechless, Controlling Words, Controlling Minds. You can order it right now on your phones if you wanted to. We could take a moment, pull up your favorite bookstore app and order it, or you could order it after the lecture. All societies have this right. So my concern here is not about any attacks on free speech, with this student being arrested for making threats. My concern with this young man's arrest is not that the police have gone too far in restricting speech, but that they have not gone far enough. Because, in addition to Jews, plenty of other politically unfashionable people regularly face threats on campus, and the threat makers often face no repercussions whatsoever. Just off the top of my head, conservatives, Christians, pro-lifers, white people, even just mild critics of gender ideology, all regularly receive threats, including death threats, from political radicals. And the threats they face are not merely from fringe cranks. Top-ranking Democrat politicians have explicitly called for violence against conservatives. Congress Lady Maxine Waters has urged her followers to push back on conservatives whenever they see them in public, to go to their homes where their children sleep. Kamala Harris and top staffers for Joe Biden bailed BLM rioters who had targeted civilians out of prison. Hillary Clinton told her followers that it is impossible to be civil with Republicans. And if history has taught us anything, it is that if Hillary Clinton threatens you with violence, you take that seriously. Your life could depend on that. Okay. I'm kidding. Am I kidding? Mm-hmm. I'd bet the farm that some prominent figure at this very university has at some point proposed abolishing whiteness or some other such nonsense. It is absolutely right to punish cranks who threaten to kill innocent Jews. It is likewise right to punish the mainstream leftists who threaten all the rest of us. I myself am not Jewish. I am Catholic. So I suppose I am, in a certain sense, Jew-ish, to borrow a phrase from George Santos. We Catholics love God the Father. We love the Old Testament. We crucially took a different turn at the incarnation and crucifixion and resurrection of our Lord, and at the Pentecost and the descent of the Holy Spirit. But still, in the words of Pope Pius XI, spiritually, we are Semites. And in light of the present flashpoint for World War III, the horrific Hamas terror attack on the State of Israel, the subsequent outbreak of war in the Middle East, I cannot help but notice some additional coincidences, additional similarities between the conflict in the Middle East and the conflict Americans see on the home front every day. Immediately following the Hamas attack of October 7th, halfway across the world, The Black Lives Matter organization in the United States posted a Palestinian flag to its social media account in the silhouette of a paraglider. The meaning was clear. Not only does BLM support Palestinian civilians, it supports Hamas as well. Not only does BLM criticize certain policies of the Israeli state, as anyone might, BLM endorses the murder of more than 1,000 Israeli civilians, women, children, and the elderly. Some were surprised that BLM would endorse Hamas. I'm not sure why. We all watched for 8 months as BLM rampaged throughout the country, burning, looting, rioting, and killing dozens of innocent people. That is who BLM is. That is what BLM does. Tactically, Hamas and BLM are on the same page. At a deeper level, the two terror groups converge ideologically as well, because the argument made by Hamas and its excusers and defenders against the State of Israel is precisely the same argument made by BLM and Antifa and other leftist groups against the United States and the West more broadly, namely, that we are colonizers and settlers who are oppressing beleaguered racial and ethnic and religious minorities who have a supposedly more legitimate claim to the land. One need not blindly support the Israeli government to recognize that the arguments against the State of Israel do not bode well for us either. One need not accede to the religious and historical claims of Zionism or the wisdom of the Balfour Declaration or even the prudence of the establishment of the state in 1948 to recognize that the argument advanced against the State of Israel today is precisely the same argument advanced by many of the same people against our own country as well. One need not understand any of the nuances of this extremely complex conflict to notice that all the worst people in American politics, Rashida Tlaib, AOC, all the rest of them, all support broadly the Palestine liberation movement. One does not need a degree in political science to understand that people who tend to be wrong about everything might also be wrong about this as well. That the enemy of my enemy is often my friend. So what are we supposed to do about it? What is the American interest as we stand on the brink of World War III? The American interest, it seems to me, is not to go over the precipice. The American interest is to contain the war. To contain the war does not necessarily mean a ceasefire, as many on the left are demanding. A ceasefire in which Hamas continues to control Gaza would seem to be not only an unacceptable security risk for the State of Israel, but also more relevant to our national concerns, a recipe for more and expanded fighting. The part that seems most relevant for us is that the recent decline of the United States and the rise of China, to quote the former and perhaps future president, raises the prospect of global war to an extremely high level. As the political scientist Graham Allison has observed, of the 16 most recent examples of a rising power confronting an established global power, war resulted in all but 4 cases. Contrary to what foreign policy geniuses like Joe Biden told us when they promoted the growth of China as a rising tide that lifts all ships. Come on, Jack. Come on. Corn Pop, this'll raise everybody up. That is not exactly what happened. A rising tide does not always lift all boats in international relations. When a rising tide lifts a nation to challenge a great power, 75% of the time it leads to war. That is the most pressing reason that the US position vis-a-vis the war in the Middle East and the war in Ukraine. You remember the war in Ukraine? That was the big story. It was always the great fight for democracy until like a week ago, and then that just totally dropped off the headlines. The other reason to contain the war is a more fundamental conservative observation. Our individual stocks of reason are small, and events can quickly spin out of control, and it's much easier to destroy than to build. American adventurism overseas has rarely worked out well for us, and over the past half-century it has been disastrous. Things have not turned out the way grandiose, self-appointed grand strategists have told us that they would. To get a sense, of the complexity. Consider this recent example. This is an alert that I got from my Wall Street Journal app about 3 days ago. Russia, which the left used to love but now hates, is indirectly funding Hezbollah, a theocratic terror group that you might expect the left to hate, but which it now loves, because Hezbollah attacks Israel, which the left used to support but now hates because it considers Israel a colonial extension of the West, which the left now hates and which created the modern nation-state of Israel but now also hates it. Then, Israel, for its part, meanwhile, has armed Azerbaijan, which is a Muslim country carrying out a genocide of the Armenians, Armenia being the oldest Christian country in the world, even though Israel often sides with the Christians against the Muslims. But in this case, the Muslims in Azerbaijan oppose Iran, and Iran is Israel's chief enemy, and in war, the enemy of one's enemy is often one's friend. Are you confused? Join the club, man. I'm pretty confused too. The enmities and the justifications for these conflicts, Israel versus Palestine, Armenia versus Azerbaijan, Ukraine versus Russia, go back centuries, even millennia. Unless you think that you have finally solved conflicts considered intractable for decades and centuries, restraint in American war seems to be prudent. Which brings me to my broader point, a point that applies to war as well as to domestic politics, actions as well as speech. For most of history, conservatives have been the party of restraint, of limits, of humility and prudence, prudence considered by Aristotle the paramount political virtue. This reputation suffered a wee little bit of damage in the mid-2000s, thanks to the rise of the neoconservatives of the Bush era, who advocated an ambitious, downright Wilsonian foreign policy that never saw a foreign backwater that it did not want to bomb and conquer. But the aberration of the Wilsonian right has receded once again in recent years. Donald Trump, for instance, campaigned on restraint, on avoiding war, and focusing on the home front. And to the surprise of his critics, Trump conducted the finest foreign policy in at least a quarter of a century, maybe longer. I sometimes think of my relatives who I've lost, who died, say, 15, 20 years ago. I think, how would I explain to them that Donald Trump, the real estate guy, the star of that reality show, the game show on NBC, he's president, he became president, and he was great, actually. He was like a better foreign policy president than just about, I don't think that, he would not believe me, and yet it happened. I could say Trump brought peace to the Middle East. That is a sentence you almost shouldn't be able to utter. And yet, it worked. How's that possible? Donald Trump doesn't know anything about foreign policy. I think actually that's part of the explanation. Trump's lack of foreign policy wonk bona fides seems to have served him pretty well, perhaps because he never thought that he had all the answers, and he consistently preferred modest victories to grandiose conquests. The left does not respect any such limits, moral, political, even biological. The left advances an ideology of total liberation from all constraints. Not only do they advocate liberation from the political order, they take this campaign of total revolution to its logical conclusion as they campaign for the liberation of the self from the body, which of course is impossible, through transgender ideology. And that issue fires them up more than any others. Of all the things they could attack me for, that's what they're screaming about outside this room. There is a perverse coherence to the left's false and prideful vision of the world, the nation, and even the human person, just as there is a humble consistency in the conservative vision. A line from the British political philosopher Michael Oakeshott comes to mind as relevant to you, me, and World War III. To be conservative, Oakeshott writes, is to prefer the familiar to the unknown, to prefer the tried to the untried, fact to mystery, the actual to the possible, the limited to the unbounded, the near to the distant, the sufficient to the superabundant, the convenient to the perfect, present laughter to utopian bliss. Thank you very much.